My name is Anne Christine Rousseau Lane. And needless to say, the Lane is a married name, but Rousseau is my maiden name. And just start with
your date of birth and where you were born.
I was born on Corregidor, Philippine Islands, May 22nd, 1938. And that was before the war. And my father was in the Army, and we were stationed in the Philippines. And just have a lot of memories about almost every place else but the Philippines. We did go back in 1948 for a month, and we were able to visit some of the Philippines, but not Corregidor.
And I know you mentioned that you moved around quite a bit as a child. Before we go into that, would you like to tell me a little bit about your grandparents? I know that you have some interesting stories there, and then we'll talk about you.
I'd like to tell you about my mother's mother and father. They were from Germany. My grandfather was born in the city of Danzig, which was in northern Germany. And he came to this country as a 9-year-old orphan. And how he did that was he was at sea when his mother passed away, evidently. And when he came home from working on a sailing ship in the North Sea, his mother and a sibling were deceased. And so a neighbor gave my grandfather their relatives' name and address, I assume, in New York City. And he came aboard a sailing ship as a 9-year-old, immigrated by himself. There's always been a question in my mind as to whether his name was the name of the family that he was representing, or whether it was actually his name. But it was a fairly unusual name. It was Kanehl, K-A-N-E-H-L. And then my grandmother came as a 16-year-old because her two sisters lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And she immigrated as a 16-year-old by herself, but had relatives here. And I don't know positively where they met, but I assume that it was someplace maybe in Charleston. Both of them had been married before. Both of them had a child. Both of them were daughters. My grandmother's daughter passed away along with her husband, and so she was a widow. And then my grandfather lost his wife, and the daughter that he had survived. And so my mother had a half-sister, and she had an older brother by 2 years. And so that's kind of my mother and father's side. My mother and father, my grandparents spoke, one spoke High German and one spoke Low German, and when they argued, they could argue in German, but it was kind of a broken sort of thing. My grandmother would not teach my mother nor my uncle German, and so she did teach others German for pay, but she would not teach her own children German. And then my father's mother and father are kind of an interesting story. My grandmother's father was a Baptist minister, and they traveled a lot, or from place to place with his ministry. And my grandmother was sent to Paris to study music because she had a beautiful voice. She was a contralto. And so she went in 2005 to Europe, to Paris, and to study. And on the way, she met a telegrapher that was aboard ship, and that he worked for Marconi. And so when she came home a year later, she found out what ship he was going to be on, and then she she signed on that ship to come home. And they corresponded for a year or two, and then they decided to be married. And then my grandfather immigrated to the U.S. Actually, he started out in New York for a very short time, and then they were married. And I'm sure that they probably were married in Waco, Texas. And they started their life then my grandfather also decided that he would become a minister because his father-in-law was a minister, and he decided he would then be a pastor, and so they just started their life as a minister and minister's wife. And my grandfather had an interesting story too. My grandmother was a native-born Virginian. She was a DAR. And my grandfather was born and raised in South Africa. He was South African Dutch. He was a Boer. He was in the Boer War in 1899. He was shot and had shrapnel in his leg, and he was imprisoned on St. Helena for 2 years. And then he learned English while he was on the island. And so then when he went back to South Africa, he said, "This isn't my country. The English have defeated us," and so he decided. He said, "I will go to Holland," and so he went to Holland, stayed a couple of years there, and then that's when he signed aboard ship as the telegrapher. And so that's kind of the background of parents and grandparents. My mother was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, and my father was born in Waco, Texas, but moved around a lot because his father, as I said, was a pastor and moved often.
Okay, Ann, so it's wonderful stories there about your grandparents, and can you tell us a little bit about your early life and your younger years?
Well, as I said, I was born on Corregidor, and we came back when I was 22 months old by ship. There were only 2 ships that went back and forth to Corregidor. There was a spring ship and a September fall ship. And we came home on the spring ship in 1940, and it was the last ship that allowed the men to come home from the Philippines, primarily because they knew that things were brewing in the Far East. And so my father was able to come home. Our next home, our first home in the U.S. for me, was Galveston, Texas. We went to Fort Crockett, Galveston, Texas. And I lived there for about 3 years, or a little over 3 years.
Okay, go ahead, Ann.
As we talked about, I was born on Corregidor, and we needed to come back to the U.S., so we came back in the spring of 1940. There were a spring ship and a fall ship in March, April, and in September from Corregidor back and forth to the U.S., and those were the only ships that went with evidently both dependents and with troops. And my father was able to come home with us in 1940 because he was on the ship in March, April. And the men that were still there in the Philippines at that time were not allowed to come home with their dependents and their women and children because they knew things were brewing in the Pacific. My father was very fortunate that he was able to come home with us, and we were very fortunate that he was able to come home with us. So we went to Crockett, Fort Crockett in Galveston, Texas was our first assignment in the U.S. And before we did that, actually we went to see grandparents that had never seen me before. And we went to Charleston, South Carolina to visit my mother's father because only her father was still living at that time. And we visited my grandparents in Florida, which were my father's parents, and both of them were living. And so they got to see me. I'll back up and tell a real quick kind of interesting story too about my birth certificate. I do not have a birth certificate because my parents just decided, they didn't even think about getting a birth certificate for me. So I was 22 months old when we came back, so it had been only 22 months, but anyway, so they had to apply for one for me because I have a hospital certificate, but not a birth certificate. So they had to apply for some kind of identification for me because my birth certificate got burned in the Vital Statistics building in Manila. But my grandparents heard of my birth the night before I was actually born because you cross the international date line. I was born on May 22nd, and my grandparents heard about it on the 21st in Florida. And so we always thought that was interesting. They got a telegram, and I hope that I had that telegram someplace, but not sure where it might be at this point. But anyway, so I'll go from Fort Crockett. We were there for about 3 years, and then we moved to Pensacola, Florida, or the area of Pensacola, Florida. Actually, we moved to Warrington, And my grandparents just happened to be living in Warrenton, but my father got stationed at Fort Barrancas, which was actually an old Spanish fort, very old, probably from the 17 or 1800s. And it had been an Army military installation for many, many years, for probably well over 100 years before we ever lived there in 1943. And 1944, 45, and 47, my father helped close that down. And then he went to Japan in 47. And my mother and sister and I stayed in Florida for another year while we became eligible to go over to Japan. And then we spent 2 years in Japan. And I got there just before I was 10. And then we came home just after I'd had my 12th birthday in June of 1950. And from there, we went to Seattle, Washington, which was another real story about our family. We were on the ship coming from Yokohama to Seattle, Washington, and the Korean War started. Well, we were on a ship that was only a couple of days out of Seattle, so they told us that, it was known that we could continue to Seattle, but the ship behind us was turned around and it was not allowed to leave Japan. My father happened to be reading a paper near San Francisco. It was a San Francisco newspaper, and on the front page of the newspaper was a picture of a man, and he said, "Gosh, that fellow looks familiar from the nose up." And he opened it up, and it was a man from his office that was on one of the first planes that crashed in Korea, or was shot down in Korea. And my father most likely would have been on that plane because his whole office was on that plane. And so he escaped twice, combat, because I should back up real quick. He had an ulcer hemorrhage in about 1942 when he was at OCS, which is Officers Candidate School. He had an ulcer hemorrhage, and he passed out on the parade ground, and he was washed out of the OCS class or group, and he had already lost his enlisted status, but they could not place him as an officer, so they placed him as a CWO, Chief Warrant Officer, but they also then said, well, you have a limited diet, you cannot go overseas. So he also missed the Second World War too by not being able to, or having to go overseas. And so I think the Lord just always had my father under his wing all the time. And so then from Japan, as I said, we left Japan in 1950 and we went to Oklahoma, which was another fairly short assignment. It was about 18 months. And we lived in Oklahoma, and then we actually got an assignment in California, and we came here in 1952. And my father was stationed to Sacramento Signal Depot. I was in junior high, and I should mention that I had a sister that was born in 1943, and she would be in probably, I guess maybe it was about maybe 4th grade or so. And she went to school here in Sacramento, and I went to Stanford Junior High here in Sacramento, which a few years after I graduated, it was burned down. And so then from there, my father went back to some schooling, and we were living in Sacramento, and then I should say we went to Seattle for a few months. And my father was told that he was going to be assigned to Alaska. Well, we spent 3 or 4 months in Seattle, and it was so cold, and my father and mother were Southerners, so they said, we don't want to go. So my father called on a general for a favor, and the favor was that my father asked that we be sent to Hawaii instead of to Alaska. And the general said, I'm sorry, I can't get Hawaii for you, but you're going to Panama. So then we went to Panama, but in the interim, my father had to go to a school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey again. That's where he had his ulcer hemorrhage. And so then my sister and I came back to Sacramento, and I graduated with a 9th grade class that I had been in from 7th to 9th grade here in Sacramento. Then we went to Panama for a year, and I spent my sophomore year there, because here it was 7th through 9th was junior high, and then high school was 10th through 12. And I escaped being the low man on the totem pole, both by going to Panama, because there it was freshmen through seniors. And talking about Panama, one of the interesting things about the assignment in Panama was that we lived at Fort Kobe, and it was on, I'm not sure it was on the south or the north side of the canal, but it was on the opposite side from the high school, which was Balboa High School. And when ships went through the canal, they had to open the bridge in order to let large ships pass through the canal or into the canal. And so there were times that the bridge was open and we could not cross it in order to get to the high school. So we'd just walk in and say, well, we just got caught by the bridge. They couldn't do anything to us for being tardy. And then from Panama, my father decided that it was time for him to retire, and he had put in 26 years in the military, in the Army. And so he retired from Panama, and we spent 3 months in New York. And we were in a walk-up, I guess it's called, for 3 months, my sister and my mother and I, and we would eat our meals over at the Army installation that was real close to where this house was that we were renting. And my father was being mustered out of the service, which took 3 months. And then we came back to California, and I was able to join some of my friends from junior high in the high school class, because then I went to Sac High and spent 2 years at Sac High, junior and senior year at Sac, and graduated from Sac. And another interesting thing about Sacramento, or Sacramento High, was that the centennial was the year before I graduated. The centennial was 1956, and I graduated in 57, and had friends that I've still kept in touch with over the years. And so then from that, I went to Sac JC for 2 years. Didn't have a real profession in mind, and so then I did not get my AA, but I met Jim Lane, and we were married shortly after our meeting, and that was kind of a setup between my mother and his sister, who lived down the street from us at Lippy Parkway. And so then we married in August 15th of 1959, and we went from that point on. And now I need to tell you all about the experiences that we had as a married couple. And we were married for 23 years, and Jim and I divorced after 23 years. And I have decided that I could not please my parents here in California, so I decided I needed to move to Arizona. So from there, I didn't know a soul in Arizona, and I just decided that I could do it alone, because being an Army brat, you do a lot of traveling around, and you make friends wherever you go. It takes about 2 years, so far as I'm concerned, to kind of adjust to a new place, make friends, find out where all the different stores are and the places that you want to go and the church that you want to go to, and so on and so forth. So being an Army brat, I think, has helped me over the years. I really appreciate having that in my background. I think it's probably made me half of who I am, is probably just being an Army brat. Every time we left someplace, I cried. I didn't want to move to the next one or the new one, but I was able to adjust, and I think that, and then the opportunities you get is living someplace is so much different than if you're on vacation and you go someplace and you spend 1 month in a community or a culture. I don't think you really can absorb it. And so living in the South, living in the North a little bit. I even lived in New Jersey. I left out New Jersey. There was a 3-month stint in New Jersey, in Red Bank, New Jersey, which is near Fort Monmouth. Just being able to move around or to adjust to a lot of different places, I think also makes me as a person or is part of my background. And I think that both my parents were a little bit wanderlust also. We all like to travel. My parents and I still love museums, love just exploring other people and their cultures and what they have to offer. I mean, I think if you live kind of in a vacuum or you live just as a single path, to me that's just not living. And that's
fantastic.
Oh.
And did you want to tell maybe just a couple stories about your husband Jim that stand out to you or that are worth mentioning?
Okay, well, we had a couple of funny things happen. Jim came from a family that a fairly poor family, and they never had pets. I don't know exactly why, but they never had pets. And so he was not accustomed to anything, even a goldfish. So the children were, the youngest was Carrie, was in kindergarten, and they had been asking for a dog or for pets. We actually had a goldfish, and we had not hamster, what we have, a guinea pig who had babies, and so we did have a little pet experience, but they wanted a dog so much so, and I had been used to dogs because my parents had dogs, or we did have dogs, and so I pretty much kept needling too because I wanted a dog too. So we shopped around, and the children went with me, or at least one of them went with me, and we picked out a German Shepherd. Well, one of the times the German Shepherd was about 4 years old, and we were living in Texas at the time, and we were separated by the fact that I was out here in California, Jim was at home in Texas, and he was going to join us, and the children were with me. And we needed to board the dog. Well, the dog got boarded at a vet's office for a few days, and he went to pick the dog up in the evening when he came home, and he fed the dog, and they went to bed, and the next morning the phone rang, I assume, because I don't think it was instigated on Jim's part, but he got a call that said, "We think you have the wrong dog." And he said, "Yeah, she did look a little bit different to me, but I wasn't sure because he wasn't." In fact, it took him about 6 weeks after we got the dog for him even to touch the dog in the beginning. And as I said, she was about 4 years old when this happened, or 5 years old. So he exchanged the dog, and that went off okay. But another thing that kind of was interesting in our newly married life was we were on our honeymoon, and it was our last day, and we were stopping at Hearst Castle. And the only tour we could get was very late in the afternoon. And so we decided, well, we have all these hours to kill, and we'd made our reservations, and so there was a beach very close by. So I said, well, let's go down to the beach. And I had bought some clam diggers for both of us to match. And he had a pair of thongs. I call them Zoris because that's what they're called in Japan. But anyway, we went down on the beach, and he had his go-aheads or his Zoris or his thongs on. And I had on some too. And we were down there for several hours, at least 2 or 3 hours. And he said he thought he ought to get out of the sun because he'd had an incident when he was about 5 or 6, and he got actually sun poisoning. So, okay, so we get back up to the tour into the castle, and he said his feet hurt. And I said, well, what's wrong with them, And he said, they just hurt. And so then we got back to the motel that night. He took his shoes off, and they were just beet red. And so he said, yeah, they're sunburned terribly. Well, the next day or two, this huge blister on the top of his foot appeared, and he had to go in and pick up his check at NASA because we had been out for 2 weeks and we didn't have enough funds to carry on for the next few days. So he had to go in his clam diggers and his swollen feet, which was not the best thing at NASA, but anyway. And he also did go to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, he said, don't you think that you know that you need to stay out of the sun? He said, yeah, that's what I tried to tell her. But I didn't listen because the sun doesn't bother me near as much as it bothered him, and still does. And Heather has a problem too with the sun, I think. So she got a little bit more of her father's Danish side than my German, Scotch-Irish, French, Afrikaans, Dutch, and all those different combinations. But and talking about the children came along. Heather was born in September of 1961, and Chris was born in March of 1964, and Carrie was born in March of 1966, and they were lively as always, or usual for kids. One story I remember about Carrie, which was lots of fun. He would not let us eat our dinner in the evening. He was 2 or 3 months old, and so we had to start trying to quiet him. So we brought him out in his infant seat, and in those days there was a seat that was called an infant seat, which was really a boom for that time and that day. And so we put him there, and we dipped his, he wouldn't keep the pacifier in his mouth, so we dipped the pacifier in honey and put it in his mouth, and he'd suck all the honey off, and then he would shoot it across the dining room table with a big poof. And we tried that several times, and we gave up, and finally I guess he probably quieted down. Well, I complained to the doctor the next time we went in a few days later, and he said, have you got a separate room for him, and is a crib in there? And I said, yes. And he said, put him in there and let him cry. We did that for a while. But that was early childhood for Carrie. And Carrie also had a murmur at birth, and we were always a little bit apprehensive about things because we didn't know how he was going to turn out. But he outgrew the murmur, and he's been doing very well. He knows his limitations now, though, because he cannot eat corn. He has lots of allergies, and corn is the major one, and it seems to affect his heart, which we find is kind of interesting. And then going back to Chris was a lively kid. All of them were outdoors or outgoing outdoor kids. Loved to be outdoors and play with friends in the community and the neighbors. And our second home, there were boys, the boys' age, which was good because they were able to have lots of companionship. And Chris picked up stuff very quickly. Once he learned how to swim, he went on the swim team, loved to swim. Heather was scared to death of the water. It took us about 4 years of private lessons trying to get her to swim. She still is not that anxious or interested in swimming. It's okay, but not the best thing. She was very timid too about riding a bicycle. It took her over a year to ride her bicycle, and Chris came along, and he took 1 week or 2 weeks to learn how to ride the bicycle, and away he went. And so then Heather was a very early talker. She spoke in somewhat almost small or short sentences by the time she was 2, was very verbal. And Chris came along. He did very well too. He spoke early on, and Carrie was the chatterbox, and we vacationed in Disneyland when he was about 2, and he engaged all the people around him on both sides of the bench that he might be sitting on. And but they were just typical kids, and I wouldn't give them up for the world now. There were times, of course, I said, when Chris went over a cliff when he was about 16, 17, I guess, in a friend's car. Yeah, we do have an interesting story about Chris and his name too. We had looked in books because Jim had always, from before we were married even, because of his Danish background, he wanted to have a son with the name of Chris, K-R-I-S. So we decided, okay, but I said, Chris, just K-R-I-S was not enough. And so we needed to have something else, Christian or Christopher or something. And so we started looking in the books that they had at that time of 5,000 names or whatever it was, girls on one side, boys on the other side of the book. And so we found Kristin, K-R-S-T-I-N. So we decided, okay, that's a good compromise. And we hadn't heard anybody else much with that name. So we named him Kristin. Well, when he was about maybe 4 months old, took him to the Kaiser for his appointments, and they would say, put her up here. And he was a strapping 8'10" at birth. So needless to say, he was also by that time, he was a pretty good sized kid. So after about 4 times, 6 times at the doctor's office or elsewhere, Jim said, I am not going to have him assigned to a girls' PE class. He said, we're changing his name. So just before he was a year old, we legally had his name changed to Christopher, K-R-I-S-T-O-P-H-E-R. And that settled it.
That's a great
but,
story.
Yeah.
And your children now have had children, and do you want to tell us a little bit about your grandchildren?
Okay, we'll start out with Heather. She has 2 boys, and she was married in about 84, I think it is, and she and her husband met in Gilroy, and they went to Chico State for a couple of years, and they got married just after graduating, and they moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. He got a job with Procter & Gamble, and they moved to Cincinnati, and they had at first said they weren't going to have any children. They didn't want children, neither one of them. So about 7 years later, they changed their mind. Well, then Jared came along, and that was in 1990, and he was the second grandchild, but my son, Chris, the second one, he had his boy first. He had it early in 1990, and his name is KC. And so now both the boys, actually, Jared is not quite 25. He will be 25 in October, and KC is 25. And KC and Chris live in Texas. Chris is remarried, and Chris's mother, or KC's mother, is not the person that Chris is married to at this point or this time, but he lives in Texas, or they live in Texas, and he only had the one child, and I haven't seen Casey since he was about 7 years old, so it's been a long time. I just remember him as a little guy of 7 and under. Only seen him a couple of times because of the distance between California and Texas. And then Heather, going back to Heather, she had a second boy 3 years later, and that's Eric. And he is almost 21. In a few days, he'll be 21, and he's headed for Alaska just after his birthday. And he's going to maybe see if he can kind of strike out in Alaska and become a real man, I guess, because his older brother, Jared, has been up there for about 4 years and loves it. And Jared has matured a lot, and he also is a pilot now, and he has really kind of blossomed in the last 4 or 5 years. And I feel good that both the boys are going to be launched on their lives. As I said, I haven't seen KC, so I don't know, exactly which direction he's going to be going in or has gone in much, and because we don't communicate very much. And then Carrie, the youngest, had 2 children, and they both are girls. So Heather has the 2 boys, and Carrie has the 2 girls. And the oldest is Carissa, and She went to Cal Poly and got her degree, and now she's at Loma Linda getting her master's. And she is a very fortunate young woman because she had leukemia about 6-7 years ago. And as far as we know, she's totally recovered from that. And we just have to ask the Lord for a thanksgiving and a blessing and all that He's done for her and for them. And then the youngest granddaughter and grandchild is Jesslyn. She is almost 21, and she is in school in Texas at TCU, and will be going back for her 3rd year in nursing. And so all the grandchildren are pretty well on their way to their own lives, and none of them are married. No great grandchildren through them. But sort of there is a great grandchild through Chris, so it is an interesting story, but I won't go into it. And
and there was an interesting story or something that you wanted to mention about Jesslyn's middle name, right? Did you want to talk about that a little
Yes,
bit?
I'd like to say that Jesslyn is her middle name is Christine, also the same as mine, and the same as Heather's. And my grandmother, my father's mother, was a Christine also. Always, as far as I know, has always been a second name. And I think that Jesslyn probably is at least the 16th or the 17th Christine from about 17 something. As I said, my grandmother was the DAR and the only native-born grandparent I have. So. But the Christine does go back on my side of the family a long, long ways. Yes, I've been living in Arizona. I left, as I said, California after the divorce and separation. Several years after the divorce and separation, we sold the house in Gilroy. And I couldn't find anything in California that suited me price-wise. And then also, my mother and father were still telling me when to go to bed and when I had to do things, and if I were going to build a house up next to them, which I bought there a lot from them, where I was to place my window and when I was to go to bed. I was not to go out after dark. I was not to do all this and that, and I just said, I can't take it. I'm 45, 50 years old. I'm escaping. So I kind of fled to Arizona. I went on a fact-finding trip out of Sacramento. I took a train and I went to Grand Junction and to Colorado Springs and to Flagstaff to see where I wanted to go. And I did that in January because I wanted kind of the coldest month. And I decided on Flagstaff for 2 or 3 reasons. One of them was economics. I could get a job there, I was pretty sure, and I needed some employment. And so I chose Flagstaff, and I moved there in 1989. And then I spent about 4 months in a old mobile home that was at least 30 or more years old. It was so cold, and I didn't have a garage for either of my vehicles. I could not get them started before about 10 o'clock in the morning after the sun had hit their engines. So I decided, okay, I don't think Flagstaff is for me. So I moved down to Sedona, and I bought a house and bought a lot first and couldn't get a contractor to do a binding contract. So then I decided, okay, I'm going to take the bull by the horns, and I bought a house. And I moved in temporarily because I was going to build in the lot, and I lived in that house for the longest I've ever lived in any one house or installation in my life. I was there for 20 plus years. And so about 4 years ago now, I sold the house. First, I rented it for about 1.5 years to some friends. They really wanted to buy it. They bought it, and so it's no longer mine. And I'm in the house I'm in now. I suspect it may be the last house that I will actually own or live in on my own. But I moved to Arizona not knowing anyone. I feel like that some of that may be my adventuresome spirit from being an Army brat, and a couple of things I've actually picked up since I've been there. One of them is ham radio, and I'm somewhat hoping to get a license so that at least I can maybe go on, not necessarily legally, because you can go on legally, but there's only certain frequencies or channels that you can go on without a license, and that's the point I'm in right now. But I need to take a test and to get a license. And my father was a ham. He was a ham for probably about 75 to 80 years. They call it a silent key, and because of his death. And I hope to get his old call sign in the future. And I also have dabbled a lot in photography. I even had a dark room when we lived in Arlington, Texas for about 5 or 6 years. Mostly black and white work, but did a little bit of thing called Cibachrome, which is something that was only a very short period of time. It was color, and then I've started with photography probably when I was about probably 8 or 10. And my father gave me a camera from Japan when I was 12, and I've just taken pictures ever since then. I don't do well with digital. I'm still the old manual. I like manual things. I don't like cell phones or computers. I don't have a computer. I have a 10-year-old cell phone. And my kids, of course, all tell me I need to get updated and get out of the Stone Age, but I'm just hands-on and gotta work with my hands, not not the digital stuff. So I think that probably my life has been shaped a lot by my personality. As I said, I like working with my hands. My father was extremely gifted mechanically. He was the amateur radio operator. He could work in wood. He worked in metal. He worked in electronics. He could fix almost anything. And I'm very frustrated a lot of times with some people because they can't see where stuff should go or how stuff should work because they're not mechanical. And I guess that's kind of unusual for a girl, but I feel it's part of me, and I've appreciated it. I guess we appreciate our own selves and things, but I get very frustrated. I'm a terrible speller. I'm not good at math, and that was where my relationship with Jim was actually, I'm sure it was a very good relationship because he could add a column of figures in his head or subtract. He was extremely good with math. Give him a problem and he could do it without a piece of paper. Not me. I got to have my fingers or a piece of paper. And reading and spelling, I would come to him for spelling. And so school was not really my bailiwick. I really liked things like sculpture classes, ceramics classes, and I did take some photography classes too as a married person, and so I just really appreciate having been given the things that I've been given. I feel extremely fortunate and blessed. I have always gone to church, but up until I was about 16, of course, family went to church because of the background of Baptist ministers. But my sister came to, because my sister being 5 years younger than I am, she came to my mother and said she wanted to be baptized. And I was 16, 17 at least, and she said she wanted to be baptized. So I said, my mother came to me and said, I want you to be baptized because your grandfather's doing it. And I said, well, I guess so, I don't know. I mean, it was just, kind of a routine that I said, okay, I'll follow. Well, I didn't really understand or did not believe. It was not my own belief, but it was my sister's belief. So I was baptized. So I kind of thought I had my ticket to ride. But now, a few more years later, I understand, of course, that's not what Christianity is all about. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. And I happened to be in a church service with a pastor after my separation and divorce that was speaking out of Romans, and I wished I remembered the chapter and the verse, but he said that just because you were born in a garage, that doesn't make you a car. You have to have the relationship, and it has to be you. It's one-on-one. It's a personal thing. And so I began to think, my mother and father said they were Christians. We went to church. My sister was baptized. I was baptized. Well, and an American, I'm a Christian. But with that little statement, it began to work on me, and the Lord was the one who kept pursuing me, and fortunately He did, because then I started pursuing a little bit more study and a little more talking with other pastors, and then a few years later, 3 or 4 years later, I was baptized on my own in Arizona, and I have had a much closer walk with the Lord, and I feel that it's my relationship, not my sister's or my mother's or someone else's, and I feel that that's what has shaped me also, or the Lord has shaped me He knew me before I was even conceived, and so, or that's my belief anyway, and so I really value my relationship with the Lord, and I have a church that I am very active in. It's a very active church. I've been there about 1.5 years. I had changed from another church that was less active, and I felt I needed a little bit more activity, and so I changed churches about 1.5 years ago, and I have new friends and new horizons, and so I hope, since this will be seen mostly by my family, I hope that you can discover and you can have a true relationship with the Lord, because it means a lot to you. And the older you get too, I think that also, I think you know that you're getting closer to having to make a decision. In fact, talking about getting closer, 3 or 4 years ago, I heard a person talking on the radio, and I listen to a lot of radio rather than TV. But he said that he was in his 3rd quarter, and the other person that was evidently near him said, "What are you talking about, 3rd quarter?" And he said, "Well, I'm 55, 58, whatever he gave as his age," and the other person says, "Oh, I guess I'm in my 4th quarter, because if you take 25, 25, 25, and 100, then you figure out, yeah, and I am in my 4th quarter." And it kind of made me stop and think, because I feel like body-wise and also projects-wise and things that I want to do, or things that I see or travel or whatever, I have some of the same feelings that I had when I was probably 45 or 50. And but the Lord has been good to me health-wise. I have very few complaints. I do have the hearing problem, and I do have some sight problems, and I have allergies. But outside of that, I can say that the Lord has dealt me a beautiful hand, and also a beautiful hand in my children. There have been times, as I said in the past, that I said, "Oh gosh, I wish that I hadn't had children. They're just trouble. They're this or they're that." But the last few years, I have just said many, many times, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me my children. Where would I be without them?" And also, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me my relationship with you. Where would I be also?" Well, I'd like to talk about the 3 pictures I brought today. I wished I had more, but being kind of a short notice and being here instead of in Arizona, but I don't even really have that many more pictures in Arizona to be able to dig out, because a lot of my stuff is packed. I am a pack rat, and as you all know, I have 4 storage units and a house, and I need to peel down, and we've talked about it many times. Hopefully you won't have to go through too much of it, but at least that's where we are right now. There is a lot that needs to be gone through. The first one I want to talk about was the little girl with a watering can. That was taken in Galveston, Texas, and I believe I was probably no more than about 3, or maybe not quite 3, because it was Easter, And I think that, that's when that picture was taken. Well, it actually, of course, was a small photograph. Well, my father had cut it down, and in 1941, which was very fortunate for them because he had bought a 1941 Buick. And he had always had poor experience in the past with clocks in cars going out after they were a year or two old. Well, they kept a car for several years, so he didn't want the clock to go out, and it was going to be of no use to him, so he didn't order a clock in it. Well, he cut the picture out of me, and it was just a tiny little picture, probably about 2 inches in length, and he put it in that clock. Well, when he sold the car in 1947 from driving from Florida to San Francisco to go to Japan, he took the picture out of the clock area and he put it in his wallet. And then I'd like to talk about the other picture. The next picture would be me on the day of my wedding, and it's in the chapel of the First Baptist Church of Sacramento on 24th and L, and that's where your father and I were married on August the 15th of 59. And so that kind of explains the wedding or the bride picture. I was 21. I had turned 21 in May, and we were married in August. And I think, and my grandfather actually officiated at our wedding, and also Dr. Christians, who was the pastor of the First Baptist Church at the time. And then the third picture is the five of us. It's in Arlington, Texas in 1975. And I believe that I had put my camera, on a tripod, and I had taken the picture of the five of us. And I don't think I developed that one because I think we probably sent them as Christmas card pictures. And how I got that was a friend who had been our first neighbor. She sent them to Heather just a few weeks ago, and I happened to see the picture and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So on the left is where I am. The right, of course, is Jim, your father. And then I believe it's Chris is on the left, and I think Carrie's in the center, and of course Heather I know is on the right. And you can figure out the dates from 1975 to your own year as to how old you are in there. And one other kind of interesting story about my father and the picture in his wallet. When he had to stop with using his wallet 3 or 4 years before his death, he had a quarter in his wallet. And when he was in Japan, my mother had sent me to the post office, which was a bicycle ride from where my grandparents were living, and she had put the letter and a quarter in the paper bag, and I had it over the handlebars. Well, as I evidently rode to the post office, the quarter disappeared. Well, I got to the post office. The postmistress said, "I'll shoot you for the postage," which was, I think, about 10 or 12 cents or whatever for an airmail stamp. And so when my father opened the letter in Japan, here dropped out this quarter, and the date on it was 1938, my birth year, which, the quarter meant a lot to me, and the picture meant a lot to me too over the years, and he carried it in his wallet from 1947, and the picture from about probably 1947 or before too. So